On this edition of Paint Your Engine, let's have a go at a Northeastern Railway Raven A2 Pacific. Before we start though, I'd just like to give a thank you to everybody who's been supporting me on Patreon recently. If you really do like this series of videos and you'd like to help it continue, then please feel free to at least consider becoming a patron from as little as £3.50 a month. It really does help. Now this was a Northeastern Railway design built for express passenger work between York and Edinburgh. So why don't we have a stab at painting the train crossing that symbolic part of the East Coast Main Line, the Royal Border Bridge in Berwick-upon-Tweed. The paints I'm using this time are made by Artina. They're quite expensive and extremely hard to come by, but if you're lucky to find the set of acryl for Ben 22mm tubes offering you 60 colours, then feel free to let me know what they're like. With that said, let's talk about the engine. The fleet of A2s, only totalling 5 and built at Darlington between 1922 and 24, were all named after cities in the north of England, being Newcastle, Kingston upon Hull, York, Durham and Ripon. If your introduction to the Raven Pacifics was that line from Castle Video's express steam engines of the LNER, you might assume these engines were rubbish. To quote Peter Woods, they were rejected as a group standard upon the formation of the LNER and had been withdrawn in the 1930s. Indeed, myths have been passed around that they were rushed into production as a last-ditch effort to please the new LNER, that their crank axles would break, their water capacity was insufficient, they were too long for turntables, and were generally inferior to Nigel Gresley's Pacifics. But flash forward 30 years or so, and people are beginning to see these engines in a new light. More details can be found in Anthony Dawson's article in Steam Railway magazine issue 539, who took his findings from the archives of the National Railway Museum. But the short version is, the problem with the Raven Pacifics was simply that they were non-standard. When the LNER was formed in 1923, Nigel Gresley of the Great Northern Railway was promoted to Chief Mechanical Engineer, by which time the A2's designer, Sir Vincent Raven of the Northeastern Railway, had already resigned. The LNER simply carried the majority of Great Northern design and practice over the other 6 constituent companies. This despite the A2s proving to steam better than the A1s while sustaining higher speeds. The myth of insufficient water capacity came from the implication that these engines were built to run from London to Edinburgh, when in reality, they were only built to start their journey halfway up the UK. It's a bit like expecting Flying Scotsman to do one journey from London all the way to Istanbul. A simple tender swap would have eliminated this. The myth about them being rushed was debunked too, as the authorization for these engines was made in January 1921, 8 months before the Railways Act, which led to the grouping, was published. The crank axles, however, didn't last the engine's entire lives, with 4 members of the class having replacement ones between 1925 and 27, although one of these, number 2402 City of York, actually received 2 crank axles in the space of 5 years. But there may have been a wider agenda at work here. When Raven joined the Northeastern Railway in 1910, he set about planning electrification schemes on the NER. While he designed steam engines, his ambition was to electrify the main line from York to Edinburgh, incidentally coinciding with the Great Northern's own plans for electrification. But despite prototype electric engines being built and a goods line from Shildon to Newport receiving treatment, the plans were dropped shortly after the grouping. The rail industry could make more revenue from coal than it could from electricity. By the time the A4s came along in 1935, Gresley had already built 77 conventional Pacifics, as well as designing a mixed traffic 262, which became the V2s, and extending the lifespan of old Great Northern designs like the old Atlantics. With Raven's engines in need of new boilers, replacing them wasn't in the LNER's interest. Subsequently, all 5 were withdrawn between 1936 and 37, despite one of them clocking up nearly 500,000 miles. There is an A2 in preservation, of course, but it's a peppercorn one built at Doncaster in 1948, not a Raven one built at Darlington 26 years earlier. Raven's dream of an electrified East Coast Main Line did come to fruition, but by the beginning of the 1990s, by which time he'd been dead for over 50 years. Well, the paints do seem to have a bit of a metallic quality to them as they shine a lot, But as for the train, I seem to have painted more bridge here than train, and I'll admit it's not my best effort. Should I try this again, or do you think this is okay? Feel free to let me know in the comments. So there we are. I hope you enjoyed watching this as much as I enjoyed painting it. If you like what you see and you'd like to see more, then please feel free to like, share, subscribe, discuss, contribute to Steam Locos in Profile on Patreon, and why not have a go yourself? Why not paint your engine?